I am so thrilled to welcome you all. My name is Menachem Creditor, and it's my honor to be sharing these conversations with dear friends and thought leaders from around the country and around the world. We are theoretically talking about a book that I just published. It's called A Rabbi's Heart, and it is a collection of writings of mine between the years 2006 and 2017. Through all of those years, I have been blessed to be a friend and a student and a co-teacher and all sorts of things with my guest today, Karen Erlichman, who is many, many things. I'm going to give a little bit of her bio so that you understand what a treat we're in for. Provides psychotherapy, spiritual direction, soul coaching, and mentoring in San Francisco and beyond. She employs a mind, body, spirit approach to healing. She's a longtime community faculty member at the University of California, San Francisco, in the Department of OBGYN and Reproductive Sciences. Karen has been in practice for over 30 years and currently serves as senior consultant for ethics of care and resource development with The Dinner Party, whose mission is to build community for younger adults in their 20s and 30s who have experienced the loss of a loved one. Her writing has been published widely in numerous journals, blogs, and anthologies, including Presence, an International Journal of Spiritual Direction, Tikkun, Feminist Studies and Religion, and the Interfaith Anthology of Spiritual Guidance Across Religions, and another collection that I was blessed to co-edit, which was called When We Turned Within, Reflections on COVID-19. What I want to say about Karen just before we introduce her beautiful face and incredible presence in this conversation is that in moments of my life, she has been a source of deep wisdom, reflection, and personal healing. So Karen, my friend, thank you for spending time with me today. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and not just your questions, but your presence. Because if all we do today is spend a second knowing that the other exists, I know it'll have been worth it. So thank you for sharing this with me today.
I'm delighted. I'm delighted. Do you have a particular way you like to begin?
I do. First of all, celebrating the person that I get to be with, because in these moments, not just during COVID, but in life, where we are aware of what a precious gift it is to have a friend. Um, I know that I call this a book tour, but really it's an excuse to see people who are sources of meaning for me. So, I would like to start because the work that you do as a coach, as a healer, as a therapist, as a teacher, as an artist, um, it takes on new meaning. And you and I have shared some of it during these strange months. I'm wondering if I could ask you to reflect from within yourself for a second, what it has meant to be in relation and as an agent of healing with so many people in these different circumstances, what it is to heal from a distance, what it is to have relationship, both professional and personal, through the distance, through your eyes. What has that been?
That's such a great question. A couple things come to mind initially in response. The first one is a question that I ask myself on a daily basis and sometimes a moment to moment basis. And this has been a practice in my life for years. And that question is, what is being asked of me right now? Because sometimes I think I know what I'm supposed to be doing, and actually I'm being guided, or I might say to you, I'm being led to be present in some other way. And since the pandemic, that question has been even more fresh and powerful because people's needs have changed. We've been really like upended. I'm imagining like an ejector seat where a little spring comes out, bing, and we're sort of like propelled in the air to be present to people in ways that may not be familiar. And so for me, in terms of just working with people virtually, I'm accustomed to working with people virtually because I've done it for years in teaching and distance learning programs and working with people in spiritual direction around the country, and how to be, not to to work around the screen, but to bring the screen, to use the platform as part of the work itself. And I know you and I have had some experience with that. So I'm just kind of wondering if maybe you want to say something about that.
Oh, I do. I do. I I was forever transformed. To be contextual about it, really, you and I've spent some transformative moments together. Um, and the one that I think you're referring to, that I'm still in, especially right now looking at you on my screen, is you are an exquisite spiritual director. Recently, you just ran or presented to a huge conference globally of spiritual directors, which I'm so curious about. But in this small group that you so gracefully co-led, um, I was having a moment, and you were directing me, and you suggested, because well, whatever was happening in me prompted you to suggest that I reach to you. And here we are, cross coast, connected so viscerally, soul to soul. And you asked me to reach out, and tears streaming down my face. I I could have sworn, and maybe it just was true, that your hands touched my hands. We
Mm.
transcended this, or not transcended, worked around, as you said, but I really do think transcended is the right way to describe it. We transcended the limitation and the distance and the time and everything, and you were absolutely holding my hand. You you did something real in a moment um, that felt 1 second constricted and the other one a portal.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm instantly there with you again right now.
I love that
Yeah.
word, a portal.
Yeah, I do this broadcast 9 o'clock in the morning every morning, and I really have begun to see the screen as a portal. In some ways, wholly inadequate, because I want, like, if we were sitting together doing this real work, our knees might touch, our eyes really would be lined up with each other. But I think that in these moments, we've learned how to sense each other really deeply.
Yeah. I'm smiling because of your phrase wholly inadequate, and I'm taking the W off and thinking of it as being wholly inadequate. And funny you should mention your 9 a.m. Time, because I do try to join you for those when I'm awake because it's quite early here. And I was actually with you on Tuesday morning, and I wrote down something that you said. You were talking about accessibility, and you said everybody should be eligible to be close to God. And that stayed with me all day and all week. And I feel like one of the things that you and I share is a fierce commitment to removing barriers to God and barriers to community, and whether those are barriers we are still carrying in ourselves, or there are barriers that are imposed from somewhere else or from someone else. But that eligibility to be close to God just really stayed with me this week.
Thank you. We've also spoken about even the word God as sometimes a barrier to God,
Yeah.
right? And so the Torah, if I remember correctly, it's strange how these days sometimes blur, and the teachings also blur a little bit. But the Torah in this week describes who has access, and the priests themselves who were born into service, if their body is different, the Torah suggests can't come closest to God. And how counter to holiness that language is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those moments where I look at the Torah and I'm like, you don't mean that. You don't mean that. How could you possibly think that? A priest who is blind can't be a priest? Really? Or if their leg is, shaped differently. And there are people in your life and in mine who are, in terms of ability, different.
Yeah.
And, we've shared holy space where, someone in a wheelchair can't get because there are too many stairs. How's that holy? How is that space to be understood as sacred? If you need access to it, but I don't need special access to it, it's not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
And that is both in terms of, the way our bodies work. It's also true in terms of who we are. I find these questions of admission to sanctuary to be anathema to what holiness means. And sometimes the word God does that too because of the way it's been used and translated in the world. It's it called to you that I'm wondering what wisdom you've gained, either hard earned or gracefully experienced, that made it resonate so much for you.
I often have this image of like, and a question about what was left on the cutting floor, like that. I- I'm I I'm just chewing on what you just said about like wrestling with the Torah itself and the freedom and the permission to be in conversation and even in conflict with the teaching. Like that's part of our spiritual practice, is the discomfort and um the friction. And so I wonder what got left on the cutting floor. Maybe there was something else in that story and in that particular historical moment in time, the story was included in that particular way. But I'm not going to get stuck there. I want to know what was left out and who was left out, um, and how that particular teaching would speak to me. Like in hearing you describe it just now, I would say something different is being called for now. And I'll say a personal experience of mine was as a young girl growing up in the Jewish community, I was not allowed to touch the Torah in my own congregation, at my own bat mitzvah. I wasn't allowed to touch the Torah. I wasn't allowed to read from the Torah. And I was really pissed about that. And I objected to it on principle, and I felt um, grief about it personally, even as a 13-year-old. And so, as an adult, thank God things have changed. As an adult, having access, not just access to the teaching, but, and I have an ambivalent relationship to the thing itself, um, but I remember the first time I actually got to touch the thing itself, touch the Torah, carry the Torah. The first time I leaned from the Torah, I stood on the bima and wept for 5 minutes. Which 5 minutes on the bima when you're about to land for the first time is a long time. And the gift was I was in a community of people who were just with me in that. I felt no shame about my tears. I felt like I was in a community of holy witnesses, and I was able to actually change my personal narrative in that moment to say, no, I can be in intimate relationship with this tradition, with my ancestors. And actually, I'll just share with you that the Torah portion that day had the Birkat HaKohanim in it. So that was my first experience of laning. So
Wow.
now I have this intimate relationship with that blessing. Every time it takes me back to that moment, every time. And there was something about, it's so fascinating because it does connect to what you were saying about Zoom. There was something about the physicality of and proximity to the letters and the paper and the however many people had actually like read from that scroll before, had held that scroll before, the person, the grandparent of the congregant who had brought that scroll to our community, like all of that was there in that moment. I had no idea I was going to tell that story this morning, but
I'm glad you did for a million reasons. One of them is because what an experience you had. And not fully being able to stand there with you in that moment, and yet standing right here and saying, What was the Torah before you got to hold it, before it got to be held by you?
Yeah.
I mean, the struggle that you're describing that, so many people have had because of the way tradition has treated them, or the interpreters of tradition have used it, which is
Right.
another way. They've left us on the cutting floor. The redemption of Torah itself by becoming bigger, which means it's not the thing at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's the
Exactly.
history of who's held it, who saved it, who expanded it. That's one of the phrases in the Kabbalah. It's called expanding the palace of Torah.
Ooh, I'm gonna write that down. I love that.
Yeah, there are some interesting books from Orthodox Jewish feminists that have struggled.
Ooh.
Expanding the palace of Torah is another way of saying also what a philosopher I love to quote. I don't really understand him, but I have a couple sentences. Emmanuel Levinas said that what makes Torah holy is not where it came from, but its infinite possible meanings.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
Yeah.
One of the earliest, I'm looking at my bookshelf right now, one of the first Jewish spiritual direction books was called Our Lives as Torah by Carol Ox.
Yeah.
And I think um, creating that accessibility and welcoming means that I want to find a place, and I think of you in this way too. I have to think about how I want to say this for a second, but the both and, right? So it's the Torah as in like our people and the history and all that it brings. And then there's like what's in your heart, what somebody's deepest longing, what are they being drawn to, what's that feeling before they have words for it. And how can I be, this feels very liberatory to me, how can I or we be a door opener, it means that I have to be in relationship with some traditions and some teachings that I either don't agree with or that make me uncomfortable, but I'm willing to be in that place of discomfort in the service of something that is so much bigger than me.
Yeah. That's beautiful. I want to live in that direction. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, it's not the same, but it is another way of saying something is required of me. Right? Like the bravery that you must have conjured to stand at the Torah, a Torah that didn't have room for you
Mm-hmm.
until that moment, and to sing it. I mean, if Torah has a soul, which I think is our collective, souls, if Torah has a soul, how it must have shivered to be
Mm.
to be expressed through you. It's amazing. Well, I we need so much time. We're gonna
I
need so
know we
much time.
do.
There's not gonna be time for this conversation. Oh God.
Can
I,
I
I
pull on one thread that I've been wanting to, that's from your book actually, that I've been wanting to ask you about, which is about writing as prayer.
yeah.
You said something in the first few pages about your writing as prayer, and I actually have, I'm going to show you, and I'll email this to you, like a little page of inspirational quotes about writing. And one of them comes from a longtime spiritual director of blessed memory, Sister Rosemary Doherty, who said, "One morning during my prayer time, I heard the words, 'Let your writing be your prayer.' That invitation has changed the way I write. My writing is no longer a means to a finished product. Instead, it has become an expression of my willingness to be present in the moment, waiting for whatever might be given. The writing has become an act of intercessory prayer." And so when I read what you wrote, I had this kind of image in my mind of you and Rosemary Doherty kind of having a conversation about that. And so I would love if you would say a little bit more, like what distinguishes writing as prayer from like professional writing or writing for other purposes, and are they actually even separate?
Oh, I'm so honored by your juxtaposition there, and I'll try my best to think about this out loud. I looked back at these essays and reflections and posts from 11 years of my life, um, years that I shared with you often. Um, and I saw every single one of them as my heart's exaltation or despair, which is what I think prayer is supposed to be, an honest emotional expression, a way of trying to find words for presence.
Mm.
And I don't know how to write professionally. I don't think I've ever done that. Even when I've been assigned to write something, the only thing that has felt like that has been when I have to write something as rabbi, and like it's a formal correspondence but even my sermons, when I take the time to polish them, which is pretty rare, even Yom Kippur, my tradition has always been I write my Yom Kippur drash that morning. I lock
Mm.
myself and seclude myself, and I just pour it all out. And that's been some of, at least what I think of as my best writing. That isn't professional. Professional feels wrong for the kind of writing I do. That'd be it, because you are echoing other voices that have seen writing as prayer. What would it be like to pray professionally? And I don't know how to do that either.
Yeah.
You know, if I'm doing it professionally, maybe that's not prayer. Heschel has an essay on this called "Prayer as Vocation," um,
Mm.
where one of the problematic aspects of religious leadership in community is that we get hired to do the thing that our soul feels called to do, which I know is not unique for rabbis or cantors. I mean, you are a sacred healer. I know I'm saying this a lot, but I say it with tears in my eyes because that's who and what you are with me. When there's an expectation that comes with a job description for the thing I feel called to do, that becomes very complicated. I
Yeah.
I poured I poured all this out in different moments. And in fact, you and I share something special because this cover was the first time I've ever used something I drew as a cover. I've had my children's art on the cover of my books. And in fact, when I look at this book, here's the first illustration inside of it. My daughter Raya drew this, and it was the cover of my first collection. This was an act of bravery for me, just letting it out. And it's not professional art either. I don't know how to draw. I mean, I do, but no one should ever pay me to do it. It's, you know, this is as pure as I get. And it was my heart in color and something. And I was listening to music on a playlist that you chose to stimulate our souls. And that's my writing. My writing is so not precise. And if I like my words, and sometimes I do, and if they work for other people as they're reading them, I feel very gratified. But the reason I'm so emotional thinking about this right now, the reason why I do it, and the reason why it's gratifying when someone else finds it meaningful or helpful or provocative to them, is because it's prayer. I pray so much better when I'm with somebody else, even if it has nothing to do with them. And if my words helped, it means that the prayer worked. And and that's the height and depth of what my soul knows. And I have another collection of poetry that when I released it, our friend, our teacher, our prophet, Ruth Messenger, said it's like Menachem slid open his chest and poured it onto the keyboard. And that's sort of what I feel these essays are in slightly longer form. They're all attempts to connect with something larger.
I'm just taking in everything you're saying, and this conversation, like all of our conversations, is no accident, of course. I've been wrestling with this myself personally, with writing, because I was taught to write professionally. And in my education, just in my secular education in public school, was taught to don't use the I. Don't you need to be objective, and like, don't put your feelings in there. What what you're writing should be objective and critical thinking and all of that. And there is value in that kind of writing, but I I had to not be me in order to do that well. And now at this age and stage in my life, I'm trying to like kind of get make space for that voice to be in my writing, and it's been challenging. It has been challenging. And I think that it's not just about the writing, it's how we live. And when you were talking about prayer just a moment ago, I was thinking about the difference between performative prayer versus what you were talking about in terms of that authenticity, the vulnerability. I mean, some of these words feel so overused, but you know it when you feel it. And when you're in the presence of it in somebody else, you feel that too. And sometimes in communal prayer, I have this impulse pre-COVID. I would want to stand up on the pew and shout at the top of my lungs, "Are you hearing the words that are coming out of your mouth?" The words of praise, the beautiful metaphors. Like, how can we really like embody the prayer, embody the liturgy, embody the teaching, and bring that spirit of play and praise and flow, instead of looking around the room and seeing people who are velcroed to the pews. And so part of my practice around that is to release the judgment I have, right? Either judgment of myself, like if I'm the only person in the room or on the Zoom who's standing up and clapping and dancing, and or has my eyes closed or whatever, then that's, I need to feel some sense of peace with that, and maybe offer an invitation to other people to say, like, oh, well, what if you prayed with your hands? What if you stood up? Not a you should or should not do it, but like, what else is possible here? I guess it's a little bit of a hafochba moment with prayer.
It's all gorgeous. It's powerful to talk about this with you, because it's not a linear thing with a start point or even an end. It's so interesting because I know for me, the starting point I would have said is here, right? My chest. But in the Kabbalistic way of understanding, the source of what's in there is not there. That's the universe pouring through the me that I am, and being expressed with the unique variety of things that comprise me, and then it pours back out, and then all of our little things that we have given the world, or that we've hoped to give to the world, or that we shouldn't have given the world, it's all out there, and then it comes through again through someone else's experience of the totality of everything they've seen, which means that we're all this gossamer, glittery, interwoven, infinite colors, portals into each other's souls, and through what I open myself up to offer back into the world, it doesn't start or end with me or with you or with us. And that's also one of the reasons the word God just doesn't work, because it's three letters trying to encompass something that can't be contained.
Mm-hmm.
When you said, in your professional training to not use the I mean, that's part of the complication of the rabbinic training also I received.
Yep.
The rabbinic training that says be a dispassionate, historically conscious transmitter of tradition. That training doesn't use the word, doesn't use the word meaning
Or love.
or love or holy, right? I mean, historical context is important, but
Mm-hmm.
I have an example. There's this incredibly holy person I know who was my mikveh educator guide once in a moment of vulnerability for me. And the practice at Mayim Chaim, this mikveh education center, this gorgeous thing,
Mm-hmm.
vehicle for holiness that Anita Diamond envisioned. My guide was actually her husband, Jim. And Jim accompanied me to mikveh. I wasn't really preparing to go, but he asked me in the last moment, would you like to immerse? And I started weeping,
Mm-hmm.
of course, yes, please, yes. So I prepare, and if you've ever served as a guide to someone in this intimate, vulnerable place, of course, words we overuse, but are the right ones. He, held the towel, and I immersed naked and open to the waters and to healing and to God. And he was so present, yet not at all. He was there holding me, holding the towel, holding the space, but he didn't invade it. That's the thing about I think as I offer myself, it should feel to the world and to others like an offering and not an invasion.
Mm-hmm.
Like, again, I don't want to, you're told never to praise someone in fullness in their presence. So I'll say gently and without the fullness of it, but with a lot, that when you have been that for me too, you have been present and you've never invaded.
Yeah.
Right? I need the you that you are for that healing relationship to be what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And and we are each called, when we get to do this thing for and with others, we're called to be present as the I.
Yeah.
But a small anochi, a small aleph,
Mm-hmm.
I love you, so I'm here with you, but I love you, so it's not about me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can give an example. Oh my God, I could just like go down talking about the mikvah too. So I just want to kind of leave that there because maybe I'll come back to it. But um, a conversation I have, even in the context of therapy, is how important it is for me that the people that I'm working with, the people who entrust me with the work, have a felt sense of me in the room and also trust that I'm very mindful with my boundaries, that I'm not going to invade, that I will not crowd the space or the time, um, that space and time is theirs, and that I'm with them, and that we figure out together kind of what that space is. Because too contracted can feel lonely, and too. I'm going to invoke a teacher of mine, Mason Chan, who kind of taught me to play with the camera. Imagine if we were like this all the time with Zoom. It would be terrible. It'd be terrible. So it's like you want to feel that person's genuineness, but not feel crowded out. It's like when you have a piece of furniture in a room that's too big, like So, because otherwise, like that sense, whether it's as a rabbi or as a therapist or a teacher, if I'm too contracted or the boundary has become a barrier, that's not good either. So it's being in constant,
Hmm.
my teachers, my spiritual direction teachers said, you are in discernment of your calling every day for the rest of your life. So it comes back to that question of like, what is being asked of me right now? And
Hmm.
not assuming that I know what that one person needs, that it's just like with a partner or a friend or, um, you know, it, we think we know, and then something happens and we have to, the gift and the challenge of asking the questions again and again.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
God.
I just want to say something about mikveh and accessibility, which is I have had the gift of um, accompanying people to the mikveh, like as a lay mikveh guide, thanks to um, Rachel Brody and Julie Batts and Mayim Chaim, who led this amazing mikveh guide training. And one of the questions that people often have asked me is, am I allowed to do this?
Hmm.
Like I'm not a Torah scholar, I'm a bad Jew, or I don't do these things or whatever. Like, am I allowed?
Hmm.
And that's not just true with mikveh, it's true with other things. But I think one of the gifts of reclaiming some of those traditional rituals is in this contemporary moment is yes, yes, you are. And how I've done that on Zoom with people just to stitch it together is, and in my office too, is like with a bowl of water,
Hmm.
right? And let's take a moment and just like fill your, I mean, we don't have two streams of water, but we're stepping into that
Hmm.
tradition with what we have right now and immersing with what we have right now, and then inviting God, the mystery, whatever word you want to use, to be in that moment. And then I'm there as a witness.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. There's so much. There's so much.
Can I look at my list of other things I wanted to mention?
Sure.
Paradox. Okay, paradox. I'm going to invoke Parker
Just,
Palmer
just
for a
that.
moment.
Just
Yeah,
that. Just paradox. That's all.
just paradox. I feel like part of what we're talking about today, and that I'm um, reading in your writings, is about the both um, and whether we call it non-dualism or non-binary or the both and or whatever words resonate, but there is something about the the psychological and the spiritual capacity to hold paradox. And so I'm just kind of wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I mean, I want to start by saying that the word paradox itself is strange, right? The idea that there are two things that are incompatible in reality is a strange starting point. Who says they're incompatible? Paradox presumes that things can't be held at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And, the quote from Levinas before, that what makes Torah holy is not its origin, but its infinite possible interpretations. There haven't been all those infinite interpretations yet because people are still, thank God, being born and
Right.
thinking and imagining and growing. And so the idea that yes, and is revolutionary, who says that's revolutionary? That might be the truth.
Right.
And we get in the way of that truth.
Mm-hmm.
There's a beautiful new book. Oh, you have it because we've spoken about it. The book by Rabbi Arthur Green,
Oh,
um,
yes.
right? Judaism for the World, in which, I've been davening it. Like I go to shul and I take out Art Green or James Baldwin. That's that's what I'm davening recently. It's the best davening ever. I sit in shul, and whatever page they're on, I stand when everyone stands. I sit when we sit, and I'm just like davening these sages. Um, Art Green talks a lot and gorgeously about how the Torah starts with the letter bet, because the letter bet, visually, right? So it starts over here and it goes in this
Mm,
direction. It has a line where it starts. It's a word. It's a letter that marks some space as before and some space as after, as opposed to an aleph, which is literally open in all directions. So we are in a world of differentiation where we think there's a difference between you and me, or within me, between the parts of me that are male and the parts of me that are female. We think that these borders between countries are real, or this sense of selfhood is real. But actually, and this is a question of faith and belief, and you know, you and I are different fragments of God swimming, trying to do good for the totality of the universe, which is still just a fragment of God. And so I actually don't struggle with paradoxes most of the time because I don't think they're real. What I struggle to do is to be a differentiated self who remembers to tend to this body, which is a vessel for the fragment of God that is me, and to be fully present with a fragment of God that is my child, that is my partner, that is my friend, that is my neighbor. And the justice work that we do for me is an attempt. I've never thought about it in this specific frame. The justice work that I do is an attempt to come closer, to have people come closer to seeing that the difference between you and me is an illusion. Justice is a way of saying we all are supposed to have the same freedom to swim as God. And anything that pushes me down or makes me think that the varietal of God that I am is anything other than shimmering is an assault on the totality. And maybe, really, I haven't thought about it in these terms. Maybe that's why I get so angry at injustice. It's because it's a lie.
hmm Yeah. I'm so glad you brought up justice and by extension activism because it's not separate from the spiritual dimension. And there is a discrepancy, or what Parker Palmer calls the tragic gap, right? There is a gap between that deeply felt faith that says we are all, right, a spark of that holiness. So the gap between that and the systems and structures that that betray that um, the racial violence that we're seeing, the vast inequities in vaccination accessibility, health disparities. I mean, I could go on and on, but it's like there is something about bringing those things together, right? Like just like you said, there's no separation between writing and prayer. There's no separation for me between my activism and my spiritual life. They're together. They're the same. And so the whatever those systems are, those barriers to the full dignity of the spark of the divine in every person, it's my responsibility to act in the service of that liberation.
Yes, precisely. I spoke about that this morning. Um, we have davened together in the same space once in a while, and it was a place in Berkeley is a place that celebrates activism, right? Whether that activism is always grounded in careful thinking is a really interesting question, and the
Mhm.
strategies of activism, and not just the causes, whether or not they're right, but how to educate people so that it becomes a process that leads towards collective liberation and not saber rattling of a different sort. I remember being asked a number of times, and I say asked because I wanted to sound kinder than it felt.
Yes.
Can you focus on the Jewish stuff and not this activism stuff? I don't want to talk politics
Mm-hmm.
when I come to shul. Like this week, we read about the gleanings from the field. My field doesn't belong to me.
Mm-hmm.
The corner of the field is not my right to harvest. And the
Yeah.
gleanings that I drop, which means my privilege and the excesses of it, that doesn't belong to me either. I didn't earn this skin or this gender or this place or these weird societal structures that for some reason position us differently under the knee of somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
All of that is spiritual, political, faith, truth, identity, God, human, world, air. And those who want, leaders of any kind to focus on some of it, as if some of it isn't all of it. It's again a lie. I
Mm-hmm.
understand why some people, including me sometimes, just want to sit down and be in a safe sanctuary and hear a nice melody and fade into the cushion and just fall asleep, as my daughter does every time we're sitting next to each other. It's the best prayer. Her gentle breathing on my shoulder. I don't stand up when everyone's standing up and that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what's happening.
Yeah.
You know, it's it's so complicated to live in a world of differentiation and to cherish those differences, because even though I know the difference between you and I, you and me, is an illusion, I wouldn't be able to hug you if we didn't have the separate bodies that we have.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yeah.
problem is when the separateness is weaponized,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This is deep, man.
This is so deep. Yeah. I want to go back to something that you said, and you were talking about that moment we shared with hand, hand to hand. Um, Last summer, I had the opportunity to be a participant in a somatic practice group for white anti-racism organizers. And I think it was like an 8-week session. And we all were looking at um, these are all people who are really grounded in political activism, white people who care deeply about dismantling racism and using somatic practices, engaging the body as part of our learning and part of our practice. And I want to just name that for a second, partly because it was a very spiritual experience for me, in addition to being political, and also that it I learned about some skills and tools for dropping down to the deeper level of what's true. I have my political beliefs. I have my intellectual and spiritual cognitive awareness. And then there's the rest of me, there's the rest of us. And to really show up and be present in that way means I want that wholeness, and I want to be able to notice and to be with the, at best, the discomfort, and at worst maybe the terror or the fear. And it was amazing to see how these facilitators taught us and guided us through somatic practices, even with the screen, things they would have done in the room, um, doing it virtually. And I partly want to bring that up because it's like the wholeness of it, right? It's the political, it's the activist, it's the spiritual, and the embodied, going just, I think what sparked it was what you just said about, we can't we hug each other partly because we are two beings. And even what we were talking about earlier in terms of the Torah. And um, I want to be open and really invite other people to be open and curious about what else is possible. And we can get really comfortable in our well-practiced ways. Like I don't want to come and hear a sermon about politics. I want to talk about the Parsha. I don't want to, I can't, we can't do that. And so sometimes it's that trusting that people are going to get what they get. And hopefully some seeds will get planted that will continue to grow beyond that moment. But really the capacity to be with what's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
That was kind of a long story there, but
Well, I think our, early educators probably get that best because they say, right, you get what you get and you don't get upset. Right? This moment offered what it offered.
yeah.
I showed up because I had a need to receive something or I wanted to be open to it. If it worked, oh, wow. And if it didn't, okay, that wasn't for me.
Yeah.
I can imagine a world that didn't know how to go to war because that was a practice,
Mm-hmm.
right? What you offer is what you're offering, and if it doesn't meet my need, that's not your fault. That's us being different beings.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a reason I went to Berkeley for a long time. That feels right.
Just one reason.
No, I had lots of good reasons, but that was a good one. And I came away understanding that better for having been there.
Mm-hmm.
There's theoretically a way of celebrating the uniqueness of everyone's contribution. There is, I think, a pretty pervasive discontent that is wrapped up in that energy too. But there's an aspirational nobility in diversity
Mm.
and that language doesn't translate easily here in New York. So I'm glad
Mm.
I'm glad for those who might be listening to us. I'm glad to amplify the conversation that way too. In the moment or two that we have left, I'm going to ask you, if I can, to share. There's going to be so much need for healing moving forward. There's a real need, and I think for now, more of us are aware of that tenderness inside. The place of us that needs help. How can we keep that part of us alive as the world stops being explicit in its hurt in such a shared way? How can we tend to the part of us that knows that it needs help?
Mm. Mm. I love that question. Um, the first thing that comes to mind is actually about grief, and that um, with whatever is coming next for us individually and together, um, in these next months ahead, there's grieving, and there's grieving personal losses, there's grieving our collective losses, there's grieving those who have died, there's grieving the comfort, for better or worse, of our life, what life felt like before pandemic. um, and grief has been such a profound teacher for me personally, and we have traditions, individual personal traditions, family traditions, cultural traditions, religious traditions about being with grief that have been with us for longer than we can remember, and God willing will continue to be with us going forward. And so I want to lean into those grieving rituals and maybe even create new ones so that I have that scaffolding to guide me and us as we go forward into whatever the next thing is that we actually don't even know.
Amen. Amen. I knew that no matter how long we gave each other and gave ourselves to have a conversation, it would only be the beginning. And so I want to honor you so much for being who you are in the world, and thank you for being who you are to me. There's a lot to explore and so much that you bring. So friends, I hope that you have gained from this conversation. I want to thank my teacher, my dear friend, Karen Erlichman, for being with me today, celebrating not just a book, but all of our hearts together and sending healing your ways. So take care, everyone. Karen, thank you for being with me, and can't wait to
Thank
see you again
you.
soon.
Me too.